I am Alan Rutberg. I am director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy at Cummings School. I have been at Tufts for 16 years. I am a scientist, but most of what I do has very strong political implications, which is good in the sense that it means I know that people care about what I'm doing, but on the other hand, because people care about what I'm doing, they have opinions about it, and sometimes those opinions are supportive and sometimes they're not. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between science and values and culture and policy, how values and political issues influence how science is done, and how science is interpreted once it is done in the light of different viewpoints. Let me put in a plug for the Center for Animals and Public Policy. The center has almost goes back to the origins of the veterinary school. It was founded in the mid-1980s, and we are dedicated to examining human-animal relationships, and here are our principles. Because we're at the vet school, we are focused on animal well-being and not just on human well-being. That animal and human well-being are linked, and we're understanding that more and more every day. And that, as an article of faith, both human and animal well-being are improved by better understanding of the relationships between animals and people. We do have a master's program in animals and public policy. There's some flyers in the back. If anyone is interested, it's a one-year intensive master's program that has also is now, I think, in its 21st or 22nd year. So that's also been around a pretty long time. And Dr. Mueller, who is here, is on our faculty and teaches human-animal interactions and some other things. Speaking of human-animal interactions, one of the things that we do at the center is we also participate through Dr. Mueller and myself in the Tufts Institute for Human-Animal Interactions, TI-HI as we lovingly call it, and there's also some flyers about some upcoming events and ways you can get involved in the Tufts Institute for Human-Animal Interactions in the back by the pizza. So, all right, so one of the consequences of human influence on the environment and the increase in human populations is that people and wildlife interact in contexts that aren't necessarily selected by people. Okay, so the wildlife has some influence on when and how people and wildlife interact. And in North America, there are a number of species that have done really, really well, who thrive in human developed environments, and as a result have interacted with people a lot in ways that people are not always happy about. So in the Northeast, northeastern US and in, the Mid-Atlantic region, we're thinking about deer, we're thinking about Canada geese, we're thinking about beaver, especially in New England and Massachusetts, but also coyotes and raccoons and all kinds of things that one thinks of as forest creatures, but they're not. They turn out to be better creatures of the suburbs. And there's this myth that, well, we have displaced these poor creatures and they're pouring out of the woods because they have no place to live. But in fact, they like what we build, and they do really well in these environments. Geese love grass. They feed on grass. They like places that have big lawns and water. So this describes all our parks and our industrial parks and schools and campuses and all kinds of things. So we have built habitat for geese. Likewise, we have built a lot of habitat for deer, which I'll talk about a little bit more. It turns out that urban wildlife conflicts are very difficult to handle, surprisingly so. Part of it is because people do feel that many of these animals don't belong in their yards and on their schoolyards. So we have these opportunistic species that reach population levels that are higher than you might expect under more natural environments, natural in quotes. Our ability to deal with these on a technical level are not too great, and I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. But these urban wildlife issues tend to be kind of side issues and don't get a lot of public attention, and especially public funding. So there really isn't much money out there to be developing clever ways to deal with deer or beaver or other things. It turns out, for historical reasons, that the policy mechanisms for dealing with urban wildlife conflicts were developed really in the 1920s and 1930s, when the problems were completely different. And so the policy mechanisms that are in place to deal with these issues are outdated. And finally, and this is the tough one, there's no longer any cultural consensus about wildlife and its place in our world. And if you get into urban and suburban environments, you get a whole range of people with different values and different feelings about nature and different feelings about how wildlife and people should interact and where wildlife and people should interact. And I will go into more detail on that, but in a sense, that's a lot of what drives these conflicts. People tend to get used to, or at least the data seem to show that people get used to having these animals in the environment once they've been around for a while. But especially when they first come in, when people first encounter them in places they don't expect to, when they see coyotes or foxes in their yard, that's quite disturbing for many people. Not for everybody, certainly not for me. Anyway, I'm going to talk mostly about deer, which is a big chunk of what I've been working on really since 1992 or so, when I first went to work for the Humane Society of the United States as a wildlife advocate. I really had no experience or sense of deer problems, although I was vaguely aware, living in the Hudson Valley at the time, that there was a big to-do in 1989 in Westchester County, New York, about deer overpopulation. 1989. Okay, so anyway, if you live in the Northeast, if you live in the Mid-Atlantic regions, if you live in a number of cities in the Midwest as well that are ringed by suburbs, you will be familiar with deer conflicts. And they are characterized by deer vehicle collisions. That's probably the biggest, most immediate public safety issue, where deer populations are dense and people drive fast. You often see deer vehicle collisions, especially at different times, particular times of the year. So in Pennsylvania, for example, along the Pennsylvania Turnpike in October, November, there's a dead deer every half a mile. And so that's kind of the most immediate issue. I'm not saying that's what drives these issues, but consumption of ornamental plants is huge. Again, deer do really well in suburbs, and they do particularly well in prosperous suburbs. And so it's pretty jarring to people to go out and spend thousands of dollars on planting and have them all destroyed in one night by a group of 15 deer. And so that drives some of it, but also more economic in terms of economy. Nursery owners who grow Christmas trees or ornamental plants or anything like that often have to fence their facilities. And of course, they do a lot of crop damage, though that's less of an issue for the urban wildlife thing. They also what I like to cause undesirable ecological impacts, which is to say they occur at very high numbers in parks. And it's not unusual in urban, suburban parks that have deer in them to be able to see from one end of the park through the forest to the other, because they've cleared out all the vegetation below about 5 or 6 feet. And sometimes those open areas are then reoccupied by invasive plants of various kinds, Japanese barberry and things like that. And so there's some sense that they do a lot of damage to parks. There's also an association with Lyme disease. I'm not going to talk about it because it's extremely complex. There is no linear relationship between deer numbers and Lyme disease, but there's certainly a public association or a sense in the public that there is a connection between deer and Lyme disease. Deer are the principal final host of the tick that is the vector for Lyme disease, but they aren't actually reservoirs. So the deer are not reservoirs for the bacteria, and so that's complicated. But it nevertheless gets raised as an issue sometime. Okay, so I like to think about solutions to deer conflicts in two different ways. One set of ways to approach deer conflicts is mitigation, which is to say changing human behavior in some way, and individuals or communities adjusting to the behavior of deer and minimizing their impacts by changing the landscape or changing or driving better or various kinds of things like that. And the other kind is actual active deer population management. So as far as mitigation is concerned, sometimes called living with deer, there are things you can do to keep yourself safe from deer. It turns out that at least in one study in the upper Midwest, most of the fatalities, the actual fatalities in deer vehicle collisions, human fatalities, were with people on motorcycles or not wearing their seatbelts. So essentially the risk factors for getting into a fatal collision with deer are the same as the risk factors for any other kind of fatal collision. It's not a huge number. It's like 150 a year. Nobody actually keeps track, but that's the guess. But driving responsibly is one way to reduce the risk. There are also things you can do to roads. Road signs are getting more sophisticated in terms of warning people about deer. There's creative uses of fencing. There are other things that communities can do to reduce risks in particular areas. If your issue is ornamental plants, you don't necessarily want to grow plants that are deer candy, and lots of nurseries have lists of plants that are more or less resistant to deer. Your basic eastern cedar, where you see in hedges, is deer candy in the wintertime. That's often all they eat, and so you can often see in heavily deer in regions with a lot of deer that you see these things just sort of trimmed off from about that high down. So there are things you can do. There are fences you can build, and there's some creative ways to deal with deer and landscaping and impacts on nurseries and so forth. For dealing with ticks, the best thing you can do is tick checks. Be aware when you're out of the presence of ticks. Check your animals too, and there's some landscape tricks you can do for ticks. And of course, the big thing is you don't feed them, right? And so this seems obvious, but I've visited dozens and dozens and dozens of communities that were experiencing conflicts with deer. And every one of these communities had a big underground of people who fed deer, sometimes massively, right? And their neighbors hated them because they knew they fed the deer, and the deer would go through their neighbors' yards into their houses. There was one woman at Fire Island National Seashore when we first started there in New York, who was probably feeding 100 pounds of corn a day to her deer. And before long, she'd have 100 deer in her yard looking for corn. And so don't do that. There's plenty of food for them out there generally. You don't need to add to it, and it takes you down a dangerous path. Anyway, the thing is that all of those kinds of solutions involve work being done by people to protect their property. And many people perceive the deer problem as a big community problem, right? It's not just me, it's my neighbor and down the block, and there are deer everywhere. We need to do something to control the population. So often these mitigation kinds of solutions are just not satisfying to communities, and they want, especially in urban areas, they want other people to take care of it. Okay, so there are a couple of different kinds of approaches. With respect to lethal population control, the traditional method for controlling wildlife populations is by hunting and trapping. I'll just say that, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, that many of the communities that have deer issues are just not suitable for hunting. It's not safe, it's not practical. In order to do it safely, you have to constrain it too much for it to actually be effective as a population control tool. But there are places where it can work. There are places in parks where the hunting activity can be intensive and directed, and it can work. But in a lot of places it can't. The alternative is what are called professional culls. Cull, of course, being the term of art for killing a lot of deer for the sake of killing a lot of deer, just to reduce the population. Those also work. They can be expensive, but they're typically done by either private contractors or police, or if it's something like a park, it might be park personnel. So the National Park Service has used their personnel to cull deer. And basically, the secret of professional culling is you don't pay any attention to the rules of sporting hunting, which is to say, you put out bait, you hunt, you shoot them at night from a blind over bait, which you can't ever do if you're just doing sport hunting. But removing the restrictions on sport hunting makes you much more efficient at killing deer. So that's what highlights professional culling, as opposed to public hunting. The important thing, before I even start talking about contraception, is in suburban environments, no matter what you're doing, it's really difficult to control deer populations because you're so restricted in when and where and how you can remove deer. This is from a paper in Wildlife Society Bulletin. These are data from New Jersey looking at 4 different deer population control efforts. They were carried out using different methods, some by archery, some by mixed methods, some by professional culling. And what's interesting is all of them show fairly sharp initial declines in the first few years, and then the numbers flatten out. And the level which they flatten out, which is about 40 deer per square mile, is probably 2 to 3 times higher than most state agencies will recommend for deer densities. So you can get them down a certain level, and then you just can't get them down anymore. And a lot of that is, again, because of the constraints. So you need, if you're going to do culling, if you're going to do archery hunting, you need an undisturbed, secure place to do it. You can't do it in people's backyards. Okay? And deer spend lots of time in people's backyards and on schoolyards and other places where they are untouchable. And they're smart, of course, and they know where those places are. So they're good prey animals, and they know when they're in danger, and they know where they're safe. So they figure that stuff out pretty fast. For non-lethal population control, there are 2 approaches that are being used right now. One is actual surgical sterilization, either ovariectomies or tubal ligation or something of that sort, and there are pluses and minuses to different methods. They are highly invasive. It means you have to catch the deer, you have to haul it someplace to do the surgery. You need the veterinarians, you need the surgical equipment, you need the money, and it's probably limited in its applications. It's permanent, of course, if you surgically sterilize the deer, and so you don't have to do it again. But it's pretty cumbersome, and there aren't very many people who have the expertise to do this. Some has been done by the Cornell Veterinary School, and there's a private company called White Buffalo that has honed its techniques and does it. But I don't know anybody else who does it, and it's hard and it's not safe. So, but it's there, and there may be particular applications for it. I've been involved in the use of injectable contraceptives that can be injected either by hand or by dart. And with the current technology, the advantages are it's not invasive. You can just whack them with a dart, and you don't necessarily have to don't actually necessarily have to capture them. But it's again with the current technology, it's reversible. which may be a virtue or it may not be a virtue because it means you have to get them repeatedly. And a lot of our work, as I'll talk about, has been directed at making the vaccines last longer. But I'll go into more detail. But that's sort of the universe of deer population management. So you have culls, you have public hunting, you have surgical sterilization, and injectable contraception. And I should just mention that in theory, you could catch deer and move them, but basically that was discarded as an idea probably 30 years ago because they die. It's expensive and it's hard and it's stressful and the deer die. And so nobody really thinks about that anymore. So that's the technical side. So the technical side is very challenging. The policy side is really quite challenging as well. So the way that wildlife management works in every state of the US is that the authority to manipulate, manage, study, rehabilitate, hunt, trap, whatever you want to do with wildlife lies with the state wildlife agency. So here that's the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, for example, Mass Wildlife. And if you want to do anything to deer, you need their permission to do it. And that's okay, because that's where the expertise lies. The problem is that they don't actually have the personnel to do anything. So if you've got 50 or 100 different communities in Massachusetts that all have deer problems, the best that Mass Wildlife can do, or any state agency can do, is send somebody to a meeting and advise. And so what that means is the way policy is structured, most localized, most suburban urban deer management is carried out at the local level, which is to say the town or the city or the village. And there's kind of a standard pathway that municipalities follow in dealing with deer issues. Somebody raises the issue. Usually it's somebody from the wealthier side of town that's had had his or her plantings demolished by deer. Ideally, the town council takes it seriously, appoints a deer committee of people who have varying amounts of knowledge, usually different stakeholders, people with different sorts of positions. The deer committee holds hearings, it collects evidence, weighs alternatives, and recommends a plan to the town council or whatever the town authority is. The town council approves the plan, and then they need a permit from the state wildlife agency to actually implement the plan. So then they get the permit, they implement the plan. It never happens that way. Okay, so we have a pretty complicated process to start with. Remember, we're dealing with a town that has no expertise, typically. There may be some folks who are hunters or some folks who are, teach ecology somewhere, but they don't have any expertise with the issue, so everything is new to them. So there are hundreds of communities all over the country that are all at the same time pursuing this particular route. And so it's pretty inefficient. But often they don't have budget lines for this, right? They have a plan, but then somebody has to decide they want to spend money on deer management as opposed to like hiring 2 more teachers. And so in the grand scheme of public policy, deer are not a big deal. Every community has 20 issues that are ahead of deer as far as community priorities are concerned, and education and drug abuse and healthcare and law enforcement, and all these things come first. So there's that piece of it. And the other thing is, as we'll talk about in a second, those plans don't go through without objections. There are people who get really upset about them, which leads to the next piece of this, which is people think really differently about wildlife. And especially in urban and suburban communities where people's experience with wildlife is very different. There used to be, 50 or 60 years ago, sort of a public consensus that wildlife was there to be used. And so the state laws tend to follow that. And so it's sort of a wise use ethic. But That's not the case anymore. And especially in urbanized sorts of states, like Massachusetts, where maybe 60,000 out of 6 million plus residents hold hunting licenses, it's a teeny number relative to other people who don't have experience with hunting, don't have the philosophy that goes with it. And so there are lots of different ways to think about wildlife. And so what's interesting about this, many of the things that are interesting about this, is that the views that people hold about wildlife turn out to be profoundly affected by their views of nature, of their views of wildlife, and their views about human relationships to nature and wildlife. When I first started working for the Humane Society, again, I was naive about the deer issue, and I went to these community deer meetings where they would talk about deer management plans for the village or the town, and people would scream at each other. They would call each other names. There was so much passion, so much anger. Bambi huggers and murderers, and I mean all this really, really harsh language that one might otherwise associate with discussions about abortion or other really socially loaded issues. And I just, I'm a kid from Queens. I don't, this is sort of interesting, but what are these people so worked up about? It's just deer, right? We're not talking about drug dealers in the high school. It's just deer. But nevertheless, people, at least the people who come to these meetings, get pretty worked up. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and why they got so worked up. And it made me think about where people's views on nature come from. And so here are 4 samples, 4 sort of graphic illustrations of different ways that people think about nature and human relationship to nature. So one is the peaceable kingdom idea, which is that nature is benign, that if we left it alone, we could all go back to Eden, right? Everything would be terrific. And the lion would lie down with the lamb, and so any sort of manipulation of nature is anathema, right? Because you're messing with Eden, essentially. And so that has deep biblical roots, and it's strongly held, and it explains why some people, in part, why some people don't want any animals harmed ever. That's one piece of it. There's also an animal rights piece of it, which I'll talk about in a sec. Another view is the Good Shepherd view, which is that nature is hostile, and that our job is to defend the domestic realm, our flocks in this case, and sometimes literally flocks, from the incursions of nature, right? That nature is the wolf, and the wolf is here to eat our sheep and snatch our children, and the place where wolves live, and deer live by extension, is wilderness, and it's out there, and it's our job to keep it separate. And there are different feelings about nature itself out there, which is to say some people, the biblical view and some biblical views are that it actually is hostile and it's the realm of Satan. More commonly, I think it's more that it's, I like nature, but over there. I don't want it in my backyard. So there's this sort of protective guardianship, shepherd sort of role that we should be, we have the domestic realm and the wild realm, and they should be kept separate. The hunters have a particular mythology which is a balance of nature sort of way of looking at the world, where they see themselves as stewards or guardians of nature, which belongs to them. And so the story goes, and you've all heard this, that people came in, killed off all the predators, and deer and other things just went wild. And it's our job to restore the natural balance by taking the role of the predators. So we are acting in lieu of the natural predators. We are the natural predators. Okay. And that's, again, that's a particular spin on a sort of a balance of nature kind of view. And then there's more of a One Health sort of view, which is well established in the vet school and at the university, which is that our job is to care for nature. Okay, and so it uses health as a metaphor for the health of the environment. What is the health of the environment? Who knows? It's a metaphor. And the health of animals and the health of people, and so the One Health postulate, which is true, which is that all these things are hooked together. But extending the health metaphor to the environment itself is different. That's just a way. That's a way of thinking about the world. I happen to like it, but it is just a metaphor. So that's just sort of the beginning. And as I said, there are animal rights views, and there are different sort of personal views, that personal relationships that people have with animals that complicate this even further. It took me a long time to accept this as true. And I think it's become more evident in the days of climate denial, climate change denial, to everybody. But in many of these disputes, facts don't matter. Okay, because whatever your facts are, you are going to filter them through your view of the world, and you are going to come up with a story that fits your view of the world, and your policy argument will be based on your view of the world. I used to give a lecture where I looked specifically at the deer issue, and I presented like 10 different facts or 8 different facts, and then presented the two alternative interpretations of the same sets of facts. So deer are at such and such density, and one side says, well, that's too many, and we need to reduce that, and the other side says, that's fine. In that sort of environment, adding data doesn't actually resolve the environment. That, by the way, is my cat Data. And we talk about this up at the center a lot in terms of, for example, feral cats. And people have completely different views of feral cats and interpret data completely differently. I'm sorry, community cats. Depending on their views, you know, so again, views about nature and cats. And the data don't really matter. People use the data that are out there to affirm their own viewpoints. So this is the way the deer story works. And so, as I say, many of my colleagues like that, I mean, see at meetings and stuff, don't buy this, but it's getting harder not to. So now I'm going to talk about deer contraception for a few minutes. Whoops, sorry. When I went to work for the Humane Society of the United States, I'd been working previously when I was at Vassar, actually, with a couple guys who've been invited to Assateague Island National Seashore to control a wild horse population down there using contraception. And they had 1 year they had a year of failures, and they had a year of tremendous success. And they treated 24 animals with 24 mares with their vaccine. None of them had foals. Whoopee, we win! And as a result, you know, Assateague Island went off on its way and ends up, you know, from about 1994 on, is managing their wild horse population with its vaccine. So great, all right, deer shouldn't be any problem, right? It's the same thing as horses. Well, it's not. And so we went to Fire Island National Seashore in 1993. It's another island, we can do this, no problem. And so we started working with a vaccine. You know, we're getting a little sciencey here. An immunocontraceptive vaccine. An immunocontraceptive is a vaccine that works as a contraceptive by manipulating the immune system in some way. In our case, the vaccine we use, PZP, Porcine Zona Pellucida, is extracted from pig ovaries. The zona pellucida is a protein, glycoprotein, that surrounds all mammalian eggs. If you take a pig zona pellucida and inject it in a horse or a deer or a giraffe, the female will produce antibodies to that zona pellucida protein, the pig zona pellucida protein, because it's a foreign protein. And those antibodies are close enough to their own proteins that they will surround their own eggs. and block fertilization. So it's really cool because that's all it does. There are no autoimmune issues because there's nothing else in the body that looks like Zona Pellucida. And it's very targeted. It's a protein, so if you eat it, it's just pig protein. It's not active orally. And actually, at this point, it's registered for use in horses and burros with EPA, and that's a long story. But in any case, it's well established. Again, the initial work was done on horses in the late 1980s. It's now been applied to literally thousands of animals. Okay, to wild horses, to deer, to zoo animals, probably 100 species all over the world, to African elephants, to American bison on Santa Catalina Island, to elk and Point Reyes. It's very well known. We know what it does. We deliver it either by hand or by dart. It's useful to know that we actually have two versions. One is the kind that has to be delivered every year to be effective, and the other, we have a time release or a control release version that we can give by hand, and it's effective for 2 to 3 years. And boosters may be effective longer. So, again, we've been working on this for a long time. And with respect to deer contraception, there are 3 things that we're really trying to show. One, that you can inject free-roaming female deer with darts, with a vaccine, and they won't have babies. So that actually is something that we did at Fire Island in the early 90s. Right, so we had shown this. The second thing is we wanted a variety of PZP that doesn't require annual retreatment because deer are hard to dart. If you've got something you've got to deliver every year, there are about 5 places in the country where you can use it. For zoo animals, it's fine, but for free-roaming animals, no. And then the big goal is, can we actually reduce deer populations using contraception? And so we basically did that over about a pretty long. It took us a while for reasons that will become clear in a minute. But the one study I'll talk about is the one we completed most recently at Fripp Island in South Carolina. Okay, so Fripp is beautiful. It's the nicest place I've ever worked. It's a resort community. They have 2 golf courses. They have dolphins playing offshore. It's really nice. But when we first got there, this is what it looked like. Scrawny deer, often in groups of 6 or 7, out at midday by the side of the road, eating all the time. They were active all the time because they had to be active all the time because there were so many of them. And there wasn't that much to eat. So it's a residential retirement community with a lot of deer, and we also had a control site, ironically called Hunting Island. It was actually a state park where there was no hunting, but we didn't do any manipulations there. We caught, through chemical immobilization, 258 females. Right? We catch them in February, March. We'd give them a hand injection of our vaccine, and then we'd let them go. And we would generally never have to touch them again. And so this is where we showed the first time that this single treatment in February, March would significantly reduce fawning over 2 and maybe with some residual effect in the 3rd year. So typically, adult females in suburban populations, 80% of them will get pregnant every year, sometimes more. And so we got it down to very low levels. And perhaps more importantly, for this site, this island site, we reduced the population quite dramatically. So this is the Hunting Island control, which doesn't change much over the 6 years or so of the study. But at our study site, it declined by about 50% over about 5 years, close to the control site. So cool. All right. So we've now shown, as of 2011, that we can treat animals in large numbers at a reasonable cost and reduce deer populations in a way that made the community really happy. By the end, people were saying, where are the deer? Because not only did they, let me just go back a second, not only were there fewer of them, but they looked much better and they behaved like real deer, which is to say you didn't see them during the day. They would be off in the woods or, you know, in their little hiding places during the day, and you'd only see them in the evening, typically. And so they behaved like real deer. So we had pretty dramatic effects there in all kinds of ways. So anyway, then the argument becomes, well, you've shown this on an island, but, you know, deer move around, so can you show that you can reduce the population in a suburban community that's not an island, where deer could be moving in and out? And so we started that study in 2014. And I'm not going to talk about the study anymore, except to say that that was one of the purposes of the study. We're still in the middle of it. Nobody cares about Fripp Island, South Carolina. The big newspaper is the Hilton Head Packet or something like that. So it's not exactly a media, you know, center. But this is Westchester County, New York. Hastings-on-Hudson is on the Hudson River, just north of Yonkers, maybe 20 minutes by train from New York City. And it happens to have multiple reporters and TV producers who live there. And so one of them is Lisa Fardararo, who was a reporter for the New York Times. So she published an article in July 2013 that we were going to do this. And within 3 weeks, there were probably 10 pages plus of Google citations of this article or reprints. It was all over the country. Okay. So it got a lot of attention before we did anything. I mean, we started getting calls within weeks of this thing coming out saying, could you do for us what you've done in Hastings, as if we've actually accomplished anything there? So we hadn't even touched a deer yet. But part of what was interesting about the response to her article is it went everywhere. One of the places it went was Field and Stream. So they published a little item in Field and Stream. And there was a long line of hunter comments. It's the hook and bullet press, and hunters and fishermen read it. And they were all of this sort of tone. Stupid. It will take forever. Put in an extremely regulated archery season for the area, giving out more doe tags than buck tags. Okay, so it makes no sense. From a practical viewpoint, you probably can't see that too well from there, but it's like Queens. I mean, there are people everywhere. There are a couple teeny little open spaces. There's a park that's less than 100 acres there. There's a retirement home over there. There's a school down there. There's actually a couple of schools right next to the park. You could get maybe 3 bow hunters in that town without making everybody crazy. I mean, you just can't hunt in that town, never mind the sort of inefficiency of bow hunting. This is not in any way a practical solution. Never mind the sociology of Hastings-on-Hudson, which is a fairly liberal community. But still, the response is, oh, we can solve this problem for you. And they can't. And what that highlights is that most objections to contraception are phrased in very practical terms, right? And so this is from the Times in 2008. As for deer contraception, he said, it is too expensive and doesn't work here because this is an uncontrolled, free-ranging population. And drugs and a vaccine have been created that keep deer from reproducing, but those are experimental and are still being studied to make sure they are safe and effective. So all very measured, cautious, practical comments. However, there have been certain alternative facts that keep reappearing. Alternative facts I just added to the slide. Because it's such a great term. So that keep reappearing. Okay, what if the deer meat you ate had been injected with fertility control hormones? They're not hormones. This can't hurt you. It's pig protein. We've known that for 30 years, right? But it's still out there as a thing. The deer must be tranquilized and then injected annually with a fertility hormone to control reproduction. The process can cost about $1,000 per year. That was written by the local newspaper about the Fripp Island study and has at least 3 lies in it. They should know better. But it's just, you know, you have to give it to them every year. It's a hormone. It's expensive. None of that stuff was true, but that's what persists. So what I noticed over 20-some years of working in deer contraception is that the practical questions changed. The practical objectives changed, or objections changed. But the tone of the questions was always the same. It was always just hostile. Just hostile. This can't work, you know, and it started, well, it can't be delivered in the field, we can't control populations, you can't do it this, and each time that we showed that we could do what they said we couldn't do, they moved back, but continued the objections in the same tone. This is closer to the truth of what is driving this. I don't remember actually where I got this particular quote anymore, but I've heard this at meetings 100 times in some variability, some variation of this. Hunting is a natural part of human history and of this world. It's called life, and all things will die. Using birth control to control animal populations is unnatural and is playing God with our natural resources and wildlife. It's about people's basic views on nature. What do hunters mean when they say playing God? They're saying, you know, using that as their emblem. The realm of the domestic is trespassing into our realm, into nature. Birth control is for like urban middle class women. And there's a sexist component to it. It threatens this idea of the hunter as a natural predator and steward of the ecosystem, right? You're not a natural predator if you're injecting things with birth control. It feels bad. And it also expresses some very legitimate concerns about the detachment of culture from nature, right? Where we're just moving this domestic sphere in there, and people who do this, you know, don't know where their meat comes from, and it raises that whole issue. And there are also reactions to the sort of anti-hunting associations. I want to point out that it's not just the hunting community that does this. We've had the same playing God response from the most fringy of the animal rights fringy communities. And their view of the world is Eden. They feel that if you just left everything alone, it would all work out, right? Nature would take care of itself. Everything would be right. And so they oppose contraception because it's playing God. It's actually any kind of intervention is opposed in this thing. So it's not just the hunters. Friends of Animals is the group that this is that has been very active dealing with wild horse issues. So where does deer contraception fit in this picture? The historical origin of deer contraception is it's with the animal welfare, animal sheltering community, right? So it's a natural extension of the use of surgical sterilization or other kinds of fertility control for limiting cat and dog overpopulation. This is just an easy jump for them. A lot of it also comes from the animal damage control community. The other group that's pushing research is those who are out there trying to protect sheep and crops and so forth from animals. And if they can't kill them because it's impractical or it's unethical, then contraception or sterility might be an appropriate response. So that's where the source is. And these are the kind of the, you know, those are the people they represent, the worldviews that they represent. Sort of a care view from the animal welfare community and a sort of stewardship view from the animal damage control community. The problem is, for us, that it doesn't have strong roots in conservation, right? And so neither the animal welfare community nor the animal damage control community are part of the mainstream conservation movement. And conservation obviously has lots of different implications, but it's not part of any of them. And so we need to figure out how to bring people along with this who are not from those two communities. Not just hunters, but there's a lot of skepticism from the National Park Service and other folks who are not tied to the hunting community because it doesn't resonate with the conservation community. And so, the best I can come up with so far, and I'm still open to suggestions, is it's a way for us to engage people who wouldn't normally get engaged and learn about wildlife into a community project that they can work And so suburbanites understand birth control, right? They don't understand wildlife. But here's a way for us to take something that they're comfortable with and familiar with, extend it to wildlife, and in that, while we're there, we can teach them a lot about wildlife management and wildlife ecology and wildlife behavior. They meet individual deer. We've had a number of volunteers at the Hastings-on-Hudson thing, and they're, you know, those who've had the experience of being with us when we tranquilize a deer have this like epiphany revelation. It's so amazing for them to do that. Also, like when we were working in Hastings-on-Hudson, or not in Hastings-on-Hudson, on Fripp Island, people would just stop by and look at us and say, that is so cool, can I help? And so there's tremendous interest in doing this. And so all of our projects have involved very heavily on community engagement, either with, you know, federal agencies who are the landowners or communities that the Fire Island project, they brought us in. The community actually brought us in. And they worked as volunteers and identified individual deer for us and told us who to dart. So there's always been a huge history of community engagement, which is not generally the case with other methods of deer population control. That's something the experts do. But here's a way in to get people intimately involved with wildlife and wildlife management. So anyway, we've collaborated with a bunch of people over the years. The Humane Society of the United States I worked for many years, and I still work with them. But the late Jay Kirkpatrick at the Science and Conservation Center in Billings, John Turner at University of Toledo College of Medicine, Irwin Liu at UC Davis, and all these different places have been collaborators with us in our project. So we do want to acknowledge them. So, are there any questions? We have a few minutes left.
While I walk there. This actually reminds me to a talk we had last semester on the opposite. It was a project trying to introduce rattlesnakes instead of removing scorpions.
Oh, yes.
And it came down to the same things that at the end of the day, I think you need to engage community to try to bring together those extreme stakeholders, which is the same in your case. And I wonder, I think it's possible to engage the community that wants to be engaged. But how do you engage those extreme views to be participant of this project?
Well, what's been pretty rewarding is that although the extreme views are out there, the consensus in a lot of the communities that we've worked is that, you know, deer are a problem. We wish there were fewer of them, but we don't want to kill them. And so this hits that sweet spot for them. There are other places that don't invite us, who, you know, are just really happy killing deer, and there's always a certain segment who just hate deer and want them dead, and so, but they tend to be a smaller number, and sometimes communities will start killing deer and they get tired of it, and in fact that's happened several times at some of our other sites. So killing deer is sort of a daily thing, is just not appealing to most suburbanites.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And you may have answered this question, but I was struck with your slide of what you're calling the peaceable kingdom and the shepherds and the hunters and stuff, and that you, at least to my ear, were a little bit sarcastic about people being so invested in one or the other of these positions and filtering facts through the values that they hold. But of course, people always filter facts through the values they hold. So I'd like to hear a little about the values you hold that, that then you filter the facts through.
Yeah, I'm a little bit wilder than the Humane Society. And so my background is that I am an ecologist. I like the outdoors. If it were up to me, I'd be up there at the peaceable kingdom. And so I'd be perfectly happy if we just left nature alone. But the fact is, we don't leave nature alone. And the vulnerability of that argument is everything we do affects nature. And Aldo Leopold said, like back in the 1920s, we could either affect wildlife inadvertently or we can be thoughtful about it. And so I would like to see minimal intervention. That's where I am. But understanding that, we can't have a community that has, 100 deer vehicle collisions a year. I mean, we can't. And we shouldn't. And so, it would be interesting to actually draw this as a graph to see where I fall in that. But I'm somewhere in the middle.
I was interested when you spoke of the hunting brought them down to, what was it, 40 deer, or no, how many?
About 40 deer per square mile.
Per square mile. And then you said they began to behave normally.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm...
Well, I'm not using the right words, but...
That reference was to our Fripp Island study. But it's possible that they behave
well, you
better.
Said, essentially, I live in an island community in the summer.
Where?
Eastport, Maine.
Okay.
And
I've gotten calls.
We went through that whole procedure you outlined last summer, and and I talked to the town manager before coming today, and she said 11 deer were killed outside of the normal hunt season. They had a special hunt in December, and 11 deer were killed. I'm interested in this idea that if you get the number down to a certain level, they'll start behaving like deer again instead of backyard pets. Can you...
That was our specific observation at Fripp Island, and so I can't speak to the other ones.
But that was an island setting.
Right, but that's not related to deer behavior, right? So do I think we'll see fewer deer? Less? More than just the numbers would suggest? Probably so. Probably so. But we have, in the worst parts of Massachusetts, we have 40 deer per square mile. And so it really depends on what people care about. So there will be some, if your interest is, if you're in an arboretum and you want 0 deer is appropriate for an arboretum. You don't want any damage. In a lot of suburban communities, they could probably handle 30 or 40 deer per square mile. But if they're in a park, 30 to 40 deer per square mile, it may keep anything from growing back. So really, it's a question of land use. If you have fewer deer, will they probably behave better? Yeah, probably.
I mean, the behavior of the deer in Eastport has changed. We've been up there since 1986, and we did not have herds of deer in the backyard.
Right.
Until 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Deer that if you go out and throw a rock at them, instead of running away, they run up to you because they think you've thrown them food.
You throw them food, yes.
I mean, there's something wrong with deer that think people are friends.
I think so too. Lots of people, though, a significant minority, like the idea of feeding deer and keeping them as pets.
We have that group too.
Yeah. That's not my view of things, but it's, it's out there.
That if any humans start feeding them that way, then they're likely to teach the behavior.
Right.
And all behave that way.
All right, we should probably leave it there, plus one, but I would like to
Okay.
thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
Folks who are getting